In the spring of 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from exile, marched back into Paris, and rebuilt his army in weeks. The monarchies of Europe had spent 20 years watching him shatter their finest generals, swallow their capitals, and redraw their borders. His campaigns had a rhythm to them: overwhelming speed, crushing concentration, an enemy always reacting too late. Every coalition had broken. Every alliance had fractured. His name carried a battlefield weight that few commanders in history have matched. But there was one man Napoleon had never faced on the battlefield. One man who had spent 12 years fighting French-trained armies and French-trained tactics, learning every lesson those wars had to teach. A man Napoleon dismissed as a colonial officer, a sepoy general shaped by Indian campaigns too distant to matter. That dismissal would prove to be Napoleon's most costly miscalculation. The Duke of Wellington, born Arthur Wellesley, did not build his legend through luck or numbers. He built it through an ability to see what others missed, not just terrain. Though he read ground better than almost any commander of his age. He saw enemy assumptions. He noticed the gap between what an opponent believed and what was actually true. And then, with patience and precision, he turned that gap into a weapon. 3 battles define how he did it. 3 moments where the ground, the timing, and the enemy's confidence all aligned, and where Wellington was ready before anyone else understood what was happening. The first came in India in the dry heat of September 1803, and it was the battle Wellington would remember above all others for the rest of his life. He was 34 years old, commanding a force of roughly 7,000 men, British Highlanders, Madras sepoys, light cavalry, pursuing a Maratha coalition army through the Deccan. The Marathas were not a primitive enemy. Their core infantry had been drilled and led by European officers, many of them French. Their artillery numbered over 100 guns. When word reached Wellesley that the entire Maratha army under the commanders Scindia and Berar had taken up position at the confluence of the Kaitna and Jua rivers, the picture was alarming. Facing him across the steep-banked Kaitna was a force estimated at 40,000 or more. Some accounts placed the total higher, anchored behind a river that his guides assured him had only one viable crossing point. That crossing sat directly in front of the Maratha artillery. Wellesley's subordinate, Colonel Stevenson, was a full day's march away with a second column. Every piece of military logic argued for waiting. Wellesley did not wait, but he also did not charge the ford. Instead, he rode the riverbank. He studied it. And as he moved eastward along the southern shore, he noticed something his guides had missed. 2 villages sitting directly across from each other on opposite banks, upstream beyond the Maratha left flank. Villages are built where crossings exist. People do not settle on opposite banks of a river with no way to reach each other. He sent his chief engineer forward to investigate. The ford was there, shallow, unguarded, beyond the reach of Pullman's guns. Wellesley moved his entire force upstream, away from the obvious crossing, away from the 100 artillery pieces waiting for him, and crossed the Kaitna unopposed. The Maratha commander recognized the danger and pivoted his line 90 degrees, establishing a new front roughly a mile wide with his right flank on the river and his left flank anchored on the village of Assaye. The pivot was competent, but it was reactive, and it compressed Pullman's ability to bring his superior numbers to bear. Wellesley attacked immediately. 6 battalions in 2 lines, cavalry held in reserve. On the left, the 78th Highlanders broke through, the sepoy battalions alongside them driving the Maratha line back. But on the right, the 74th Highlanders, caught in murderous fire from Assaye village, were torn apart and nearly overrun. Wellesley committed the 19th Light Dragoons in a ferocious charge that smashed into the Maratha flank and saved what remained of the 74th. He then pulled the 78th across to reinforce the right. Some Maratha gunners feigned death and rose again to fire into the backs of the advancing British. 2 horses were killed under Wellesley. His orderly was struck dead at his side. He did not leave the field. After 3 to 4 hours, the Maratha army collapsed and withdrew across the Jua. British casualties were close to 1,600, among the highest proportional losses in any British battle of the era. The Maratha artillery train was captured. Scindia and Berar were forced to terms before the year was out, and Britain became the dominant power in the subcontinent. Years later, asked what was the finest thing he had ever done in the way of fighting, Wellington gave a one-word answer: Assaye. 9 years passed. The man who had crossed an invisible ford in India was now fighting a grinding, exhausting war across the Iberian Peninsula, matching French marshal after French marshal in a campaign that had already outlasted every prediction. By the summer of 1812, Wellington commanded roughly 52,000 Anglo-Portuguese-Spanish troops in western Spain. Opposite him, Marshal Marmont led around 49,000 French soldiers, veterans of the Napoleonic system, trained in the aggressive, fast-moving tactics that had shattered armies across Europe. For 3 weeks, the two forces marched parallel across the Spanish countryside, southeast of Salamanca, each probing for advantage, neither willing to attack at a disadvantage. The ridgelines came and went. The dust rose and settled. Wellington, by his own account, had never been so exhausted. And Marmont was growing confident. He had reason to be. Wellington's previous victories in Portugal, at Busaco, behind the lines of Torres Vedras, had all been defensive. Marmont had absorbed Napoleon's assessment. Wellington would not launch a major offensive strike. He was a careful man, a reactive man. Napoleon himself had dismissed him as a product of colonial warfare, incapable of the decisive offensive maneuver that defined truly great commanders. Marmont believed this completely. It was the assumption that killed him. On the afternoon of July 22nd, Marmont stood on the Greater Arapaile Hill and watched Wellington's lines through his glass. He was convinced the British were retreating toward Portugal. He ordered his divisions to wheel westward, marching along a ridge toward Miranda de Azan, attempting to get around Wellington's right flank and cut his road back to his base. Division after division turned and marched. The columns stretched, the pace varied, and slowly, the French left wing began to separate from the rest of the army. The leading division pulling ahead, opening a gap of over a mile between itself and the formations behind, still moving in column of march, not deployed for battle. Wellington was eating lunch in a farmyard. He watched through his telescope as the gap opened. Then he put the glass down. He had already done something Marmont did not know about. Before the day's marching had begun, he had positioned Major General Pakenham's 3rd Division out of sight, west of Salamanca itself, behind the city, on the road to Ciudad Rodrigo. They were waiting. And now Wellington gave the order. Pakenham's division came around the city's western edge and struck the leading French division from the flank while it was still in column. The French had no time to form a line, no time to form a square. Pakenham's men went through them. Simultaneously, the British 4th, 5th, and 6th Divisions surged forward along the central ridge, each hitting a portion of the French line before the gaps could close and the army could concentrate. British heavy cavalry swept through the wreckage. Marmont was wounded by a shell early in the fighting and removed from command. His replacement, General Clausel, launched a dangerous counterattack on the Allied left that threatened to unravel the whole operation, a genuine crisis. But without Marmont, without coordination, and with the right wing already collapsing, it could not hold. The French left wing was effectively destroyed in under 40 minutes. An eyewitness account, widely repeated at the time, put it plainly: Wellington had defeated an army of 40,000 men in 40 minutes. The French General Foy, who commanded the one division that managed to withdraw in order, later wrote that Salamanca was the most masterly, the most important in its results, battle the English had ever gained, one that raised Wellington nearly to the height of Marlborough. Madrid fell 2 months later. The French were forced out of Andalusia and Asturias. The war in the peninsula had turned. The sepoy general, as Napoleon had called him, had just delivered one of the most precisely timed offensive strokes in the entire Napoleonic era. 3 years later, on a Belgian ridge south of the village of Waterloo, Wellington would fight the battle that ended an era. And he would do it in a way that looked, from the French side, like nothing more than stubborn defense, which was precisely the point. Napoleon had 72,000 men. Wellington had roughly 68,000, but freely admitted in letters written before the campaign that his army was weak, inexperienced, and poorly equipped. 2 days before Waterloo, at the Battle of Ligny, Napoleon had beaten the Prussians under Blücher and attempted to drive a permanent wedge between the two coalition armies. Wellington had held the crossroads at Quatre Bras, but was forced to fall back when the Prussians retreated. The situation looked dangerous. But Wellington had agreed something with Blücher. Despite the defeat at Ligny, the Prussian army would march to support him. Wellington would choose ground and hold it until they arrived. He chose the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean because he had scouted it before the campaign began. He knew every fold of that ground. The ridge was roughly 2.5 miles wide, running east to west, with a reverse slope dropping away behind the crest toward Brussels. Wellington placed the bulk of his infantry on that reverse slope, out of sight from French positions, shielded from the massive artillery Napoleon would inevitably bring to bear, their numbers and positions concealed. On the forward slope, and in the valley below, he stationed a heavy skirmish line and garrisoned 3 positions: the chateau complex of Hougoumont on the right, the fortified farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center, and the hamlet of Papelotte on the left. His left flank was deliberately held lighter. Blücher's Prussians were expected to arrive from the east as the day progressed and fill that sector. An additional 17,000 troops waited at Halle, 8 miles to the west, guarding against any wide flanking move. Napoleon's plan was logical and powerful: a massive artillery bombardment to suppress the ridge, an attack on Hougoumont to draw Wellington's reserves to the right, then a crushing central blow with d'Erlon's corps, with the Imperial Guard ready to finish it. He believed his guns would break the British line before Blücher could arrive in force. He had sent Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to follow the Prussians and delay them, a detachment that would ultimately fail to affect either army. What Napoleon did not fully account for was the ground. His guns fired over the crest of the ridge. The shells struck the earth behind Wellington's lines or passed overhead. The infantry sheltering on the reverse slope absorbed far less punishment than French artillery should have inflicted on a position of that size. When the attack on Hougoumont began at 11:30 in the morning, Wellington's garrison held the chateau, the orchard, and the gardens against every assault. The French committed more and more troops, eventually around 14,000, without ever breaking the position or pulling Wellington's reserves away from the critical center. Hougoumont was not simply being defended, it was draining the French offensive at Wellington's choosing. d'Erlon's corps advanced at around 1 in the afternoon, 14,000 men moving against the Allied center, and left. British heavy cavalry countercharged and broke the corps before it could consolidate, capturing 3,000 prisoners. The British cavalry overran its objective and suffered heavily on the return, an error Wellington could not prevent. But the crisis had passed. Through the long afternoon, wave after wave of French heavy cavalry, around 5,000 cuirassiers, charged up the slope between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Wellington's infantry formed squares and held. The cavalry broke repeatedly against formations that would not shatter, and French artillery, firing at the squares between charges, could not break the discipline of men who had been trained exactly for this moment. The most dangerous point came near 6 in the evening when La Haye-Sainte finally fell, and French guns moved forward to cannonade the Allied center at close range. Wellington's line bent, but did not break. From the east, the Prussians had been arriving since 4:30. pressing hard on Napoleon's right flank and fighting for the village of Plancenoit. Napoleon was bleeding strength on two fronts simultaneously. His window to break Wellington was closing. At around 7 in the evening, he committed the Imperial Guard. They had never been broken in battle. Their advance up the slope was a statement of what Napoleon believed, that one final push could still decide the day. They came forward in tight columns through intense artillery fire, steady and experienced. And as they crested the ridge, they met something they had not seen. British infantry rising from the reverse slope at close range, delivering volleys that tore through columns that had no room to deploy. The Imperial Guard faltered. Then it broke. For the first time in its history, Wellington raised his hat. The whole Allied line advanced. Napoleon's army came apart, and the Prussian cavalry pursued through the night. French losses reached 40,000. Napoleon abdicated days later and went into exile on St. Helena, where he remained until he died. The Napoleonic Wars were over. Wellington called Waterloo the nearest run thing he had ever seen in his life. He was right. Every phase of that battle had a moment of genuine crisis, but every phase also had an answer, because Wellington had chosen the ground, designed the defense, and understood exactly what Napoleon would do with a ridge he couldn't fully see. That is the pattern that runs through all three of these battles. At Assaye, he crossed a river that wasn't supposed to exist. At Salamanca, he attacked when no attack was expected. At the exact moment the French column was strung out and unsupported. At Waterloo, he hid his army behind a ridge until Napoleon had spent his strength, and then he walked forward. Every time, the enemy had a plan. Every time, the plan rested on an assumption about what Wellington would or wouldn't do. And every time, that assumption was wrong. Pullman had a river. Marmont had a march route. Napoleon had a ridge, and the finest army he could build in 100 days. None of it was enough. Not because Wellington was reckless or lucky, because he read the ground, found the weakness, and waited for the right moment with a patience that most commanders never manage. The only man who stopped Napoleon didn't outrun him, didn't outgun him. He simply saw the battlefield more clearly and acted on what he saw before anyone else understood what was happening.